I am here today with Bruce Momjian. And can you introduce yourself briefly, Bruce?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Bruce Momjian. I live in Philadelphia. I normally would be at Fosdem, but of course I'm not going to go this year. I travel about 90 days a year and do about 30 or 35 events. But again, I've been home for 11 months. It's been really good. I've been working with Postgres since 1996. I'm one of the core team members, and I'm an employee of Enterprise DB. Been with them for 14 years. My primary job is actually not with Enterprise DB work specifically, but a lot of it is the community work, sort of working with the community, making sure it's healthy, and obviously doing the kind of events that we do, writing presentations, blogging, stuff like that.
Awesome, thank you. So, are you excited about Fosdem? No, right? Like, if you're not excited
I
when the
know I
conference
badmouth
is
it all the
normal.
I badmouth it all the time because it's just it's a facility that's so crowded that I can never see anything. I can never get in the door a lot of times. Um,
What?
but I am happy that we're doing it because I think in this format we can have a lot more people. It may be more effective in this format because we can get more people in the room, right? Um, I'm a little disappointed we're not doing it live, so we're recording and then they're playing back the recordings. It's not as much fun, but I understand why they're doing it. They have to do it that way.
Yeah.
Um, but the talks looked really good. Somebody even just today was talking about Oleg Bartunov's talk
Mm-hmm.
about JSON, and they said it looks really good. So it's kind of interesting. Like, people are already talking about the content we're presenting at FOSDEM, and it hasn't even happened yet.
Yeah, totally. But I look at the schedule today. I'm seeing some organization are totally against doing FOSDEM, so they're not even participating. Like there is half of the dev room compared to last year, and instead some organization are going strong with that. So
Why are they not doing it?
I have no idea. Probably they don't like it. Like if you see the Mozilla Dev Room, there are like four talks. I remember last year it was 2 full days on Mozilla, or it's 1 full day. So I don't know. I'm quite happy that
We
Postgres is going so strong. Postgres has 2 full days. That's awesome. But actually, I was expecting
right.
this from everyone.
So I'm wondering, I noticed there was no security track this year, which I also found kind of odd because the security track when I went last year was really big. So are they having their own thing? Maybe they're doing their own event. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know. One of the great things about FOSDEM is you see everybody from everywhere, and that's going to be a little hard. So that's going to be a negative because I used to see people from Vietnam, Singapore, uh, a bunch of people from California. I don't see a lot. People certainly from Eastern Europe. I don't see a lot. We're all at FOSDEM, and I would always catch up with them. When we went, that was always a lot of fun. But this is going to be a little different. That's okay.
Yeah, actually, like this year will be the first post that I don't get a cold because usually I'm so busy running around constantly between 7 different dev rooms and the booth and everything that like half of the time I don't have my coat on and I get a cold every time. So,
That's funny. So when I travel, I always dress very warmly, and I'm always in bed by about 9 o'clock. So I always get. That's one of the tricks I found is that when I travel the way if you're traveling for 2 or 3 weeks and you get a cold, that rest of that trip is going to be really hard, right?
totally.
You can't just kind of like run home and like, oh, I'll get better later. So I'm always in bed very early, and if I get like 9 hours of sleep, or sometimes 10 hours of sleep if I'm fighting a cold, and then I wake up and I'm actually fine. So I almost never get sick on a trip, but it's only
um,
because I'm in bed so early that yeah, it makes a big difference.
yeah, that's actually a pretty good trick, but I'm not sure I will ever be able to put it on in practice. I remember last PGConf EU, I was averaging 4 hours of sleep every night. I was dead.
Yeah, now you have to, now you gotta. I'll tell you, when I started, I did that for a while. A couple trips, I did that, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I became very religious about like Like nothing, really nothing interesting happened after about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. People would just sit around, but nothing interesting. So I'm like,
Mm.
I don't care what interesting I'm missing. I got to go to bed. I remember a couple times I would sleep for like 11 hours if I had a day that I wasn't busy. Like maybe I wake up and like 11 hours disappeared. I guess because I was catching up from the flight and the time change and all that other stuff. But I felt great, and I was ready to go. And sometimes it's funny. The past trip I took from Fosdem to Russia, and I think it was a 3 week trip. It was a whole bunch of places, and I ended up in I think Ukraine, no, Belarus. And somebody came to me. There was some woman who came to me, and she said, "We're sitting eating dinner, lunch or something," and she said, you look fine. And I'm like, yeah, I think I do. Like, why are you saying that? And they said, well, you've been traveling for 2.5 weeks. I thought you'd look tired. And I'm like, well, I said I go to bed real early and I kind of don't, try and do too much. I don't do any work when I'm traveling. Like I read my personal email. I don't read the community email. I don't really read my work email very much. So because you can sometimes go to an event during the day, and if you start reading or doing work at night, you can work till 12, 1 o'clock, and the time just flies by, right? So I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm coming into the hotel room. I'll answer any personal email, and I'm just going to sit. Maybe I'll read a book, and then I'm going to go to sleep, and I'm not going to do anything else. And that's why, yeah, 2.5 weeks, somebody's sitting with me, and they're like, "You look fine." I'm like, "Yeah." Did you think I wasn't going to look fine? They're like, well, you've been traveling a lot. You've been away from home for 2.5 weeks. What happens is everyone typically I've seen is if you have a conference, it's a week or even 3 days. By the third day, like the first day, the second day, the people can kind of power through it. But by the third day, they're just not looking good, right? They're kind of just like, yeah. So yeah, it's discipline, but you have to do it. For me anyway, I had to do it.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But you have a lot more experience than I have with this, so
Yeah, yeah. It takes a while to learn, but
yeah, exactly. I
sometimes when
imagine.
I'm traveling with my kids, because my kids come with me a lot, I'll go back to the hotel. They'll stay out with everybody, right? Because they don't have to get up in the morning. So they'll go out with Magnus or Dave Page or Jonathan Katz or something, and they'll go to a restaurant, and they'll go to the bar or whatever, and I'll be back in the hotel room and like asleep.
Wow.
But then they can come back and they can sleep through the morning, and I got to get up. So it works out. It works out.
Yeah, totally. Especially because I've been noticing that your talks are always early in the morning. So maybe there's a correlation
Yeah,
between
they a
that.
lot of times they do that. Not at Fosdem this time, but usually they do that because they want to make sure that people get there in the morning. So if you put I usually I'm either at the beginning or the end. So they might put me at the end because they want people to stay, or they might put me in the morning. Sometimes the first thing on the second day. So they'll put me at the beginning of the second day because they're worried that people will be out the first night and they won't show up on time. So they'll put me right at that like start, and that's fine. I'm always awake. So I
Yeah,
mean,
totally.
if you go to bed at 9:30, you're going to be up at like 7, right? I mean,
Hmm.
no problem. Even if you have trouble sleeping in the hotel, you'll be up at 8 o'clock, right? So you'll be fine. They know you're going to be there. They know you're not going to sleep through, right? So I think that's why that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. So how has COVID impacted Postgres and conferences?
Well, we've done a lot fewer events. Obviously, I'm not obviously not traveling. Although oddly, I did the same number of events last year as I did the year before. So last year, I think I did 35 events, and I usually do about between 30 and 40. So even though there were fewer events last year for Postgres, I could attend a higher percentage of those events, right? Because I didn't have to fly anywhere,
Yeah.
right? So now all of a sudden they have an event in Chicago. I'm there. right? They have an event in Europe, I'm there, right? They had an event I spoke in China twice. I spoke in Israel in November. So, somebody will invite me and they'll say, "Can you come speak in China?" I remember I got an invite and it was to speak in China and I was like, I said yes, and I wasn't sure if it was a virtual event or not. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, am I going to have to fly to China for this? Um, but then I asked him. He said, no, we just need it's a virtual event, or it's an in-person event, but we want you to speak virtually. That was the actual case in Hangzhou in January. They had a virtual event. They had, I think, 300 people 500 people in the hotel, and they had 1,600 people, and I gave three presentations at that conference. I give so that's the great part, is that we're having fewer events, but you can now attend more of them because there's no travel cost, there's no hotel cost. You don't have to spend the time going there. So I think for the China conference, one of them I had to wait. I had to give a presentation at like I don't know, 11 p.m. or 2 a.m. And I was like, that's fine. Israel, I gave a conference in Israel. I had to give it at 2 a.m. I said, I am totally fine with that because the amount of time I would take to go to Israel, as much as I'd love to go there, and then fly home, if I have to get up at 1:45 in the morning and give a talk and go back to sleep, that is so much easier than actually going there. So I am sometimes I'm doing a whole conference from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. In Asia time. And I'll just sleep during the day, and then I'll be up from 10 to 4, and then I'll go to sleep, and I'll get up at 11 or something in the morning, and it works. So yeah, so that's kind of there's fewer events, but it's easier to attend them. I think things are still going. We're still doing stuff. I'm excited about that. It shows the resilience of the community that even though we have COVID, we're still having events and people are still showing up. And sometimes I bet with Fosdem and a lot of other events, we're going to get a lot more people on a virtual than we ever got in person.
Yeah, you're like the first person I speak to which actually enjoys this situation with the online conferences. But I think that's because you attend them, like you're a speaker at 40 conferences every year, so usually it's different. I'm guessing, yeah, in your situation, it's actually easier to wake up in the middle of the night. Yeah.
Yeah, some of the, you know what it is, some of the fun goes away. So if you're going to the conference just to have social time with people, then yeah,
Mm.
it's not going to be as much fun. But for me, my goal, as much as I enjoy the social part, my goal is to help build the community. So even though I'm not having as much fun doing it, right? I'm building the community. I'm able to talk to China multiple times a year. I was able to do the Israel conference. I'm going to be doing a Moscow conference in March, although I'm normally at the Moscow conference, so that's a different case. But um, for me, the core goal is still happening,
Oh, I
right?
love this. I love this.
And that's what it's all about, right? I did a calculation. I think I traveled since 2000. I've traveled about 1,200 days or 1,300 days, which is like I guess 3 years, 3.5 years out of 20. So it's not that bad, right? And I've been to a lot of these cities, yeah, and I love doing stuff with people, but at the same time, hey, the goal is to build the community, and if we have to suffer for a year or two and not do that, then it so be it. It'll pick up later. There aren't a whole lot of places I haven't been yet, although there's still a lot I'd love to see. So it'll be back, but we're soldiering on, and I appreciate the people like Fosdem who are having these events still and making them happen because it is a lot of work.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's actually motivating to hear that someone thinks like you. Especially because most of the community is really sad, but yeah, there's people like you who actually make me think, yeah, maybe we should have another online conference, a Postgres
Yeah,
online conference. So thank you for
yeah.
that.
I just heard recently that PGCon is going to have a much scaled back. The one in Ottawa is going to be much more scaled back this year.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's at the
that's
beginning of March. Yeah.
the one in May.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
yeah. So anyway, that's the one in Ottawa, Canada. I think it's going to be virtual, and it's going to be smaller. So that's a disappointment. Yeah, that's a good example of something we're not having because we had it
Yeah.
last year and it was very nice.
Oh yeah. So yeah, also the Postgres Open is probably gonna be online.
Yeah,
So then we'll see. Hopefully in like 6 months or something we can have
yeah.
in-person conferences again. So what do you think are the open source bright spot of the last year and this year?
So I think the bright spots are, I think I addressed this earlier, is the concept of resilience. Um, that even though everyone's taken a hit in the past 12 months, the open source has actually seems to have grown during this period. People are more focused, I think, on changing their way of doing things to a more modern way. Not that it would have happened anyway, but I think in some sense, this crisis has sort of accelerated some changes that are already in process. I know at Enterprise DB, and certainly I think all the other vendors, I've talked to some of the other Postgres vendors, they're all very busy. Companies are just moving, pretty quickly, to adopt our technology faster, probably even than they might have without this, because everything's got sort of spun around, and people are home now, and they're now thinking, do I want to keep doing this things the same way I used to? And a lot of them say no. Maybe I don't need to go into the office every day. Maybe I don't need to travel to visit every customer. I was telling you earlier, salespeople used to get on a plane Monday and they'd fly to a customer, and then Monday night they'd fly to the next customer, and then Tuesday night they'd fly to the next customer. I think that part of the travel may never return, and I thank good riddance. I've never been able to do that. We were talking about my travel. When I travel, I go for 2 3 weeks, and I'm in the whole region, very relaxed amount of time usually. I spend 4 or 5 days in a hotel. I think I've lived there forever. But a lot of people are just continually moving. They're continually going city. Every day is a new city. I've never been able. I have great trouble doing that, and I think that part may not come back. And I think that's great. I think, in some sense, the virtual aspect really plays into some of the strengths of open source, because we've been doing things virtually forever, right? So it's not a new thing for us.
Yeah, totally. Is there any specific open source organization or system which you particularly like, which got famous during Corona? For instance, say, I don't know, I personally love Big Blue Button, it's amazing. Jits is also one.
Um, I'm trying to think. I have my head so much in Postgres. Uh, uh,
How
I'm trying to
unsurprising.
think. Yeah, I have to admit, I haven't. Postgres almost consumes me. I haven't. I use a lot of open source, of course, but I haven't. I haven't really had a lot of time to work with those communities as much as I do. I do when I go to Fosdem. Actually, I get to see these communities in person, so that's actually a great opportunity. But again, that won't happen this year. Last year, as I said, I had to leave before the university piece started. So I haven't. I missed that opportunity last year. So I don't know too much about what else is going on. I read newspaper articles, but I haven't seen anything really stick out at me.
Oh, I don't know. Like from my perspective, I can tell you that academia is switching so hugely to open source. Like it's
That's great.
crazy.
That's always been a it always seemed like a natural, and I've just had great trouble getting them to do it. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you. I feel you. But then, yeah, it turns out that if they need a hosting system, they have to choose between paying so much for a month and not paying anything. It's easier to set up a
Right.
university server for streaming and such. So it's crazy. It's crazy. I've also learned to appreciate IRC channels and metrics and all of that stuff, which is a bit outdated if you think so. But yeah, it's actually okay, especially for a younger perspective.
Yeah.
So I've seen you have two talks at Fosdem. One is about databases and one is about artificial intelligence. So first of all, what is your motivation between those two talks?
Yeah, so as I we talked privately before, one of the great is about being housebound for 11 months is that I'm able to take some of the ideas I've had for talks and actually write them down. So I think I've written 3 or 4 talks in the past 11 months, which is unusual. Usually I do 1 or 2 talks a year, but this year I was able to do more. Um, and they're topics that took a lot of research. The first talk is about democracy and open source databases. And that one really took a lot of thinking about how democracy works and how the success of open source parallels the same strengths that democratic governance has. I know it sounds like you're like, what, right? But once you watch the talk, you'd be like, yeah. So if you think of authoritarian governments as being proprietary, and you think of open source as being democratic, the reason democratic societies are so much more productive is the same reason that open source compared to autocratic systems is the same reason open source is so much more productive than proprietary development models. So it's kind of interesting, not something you would have thought off the top of your head, but it's kind of funny. I wrote it recently and it's gotten a lot of interest. I've delivered it already probably 4 or 5 times. I only wrote it maybe 6 months ago. So that one is an interesting thought piece. I'm not surprised they picked it because it is really a great fit for people who want to think of open source in a very large, perspective. The second talk is about artificial intelligence, and that one required a lot of research because there's a lot of very fluff articles out there about artificial intelligence and oh, it's going to take over the world and it's going to do all our jobs for us, right? We've all heard it, right? But exactly what is it and why are databases particularly positioned to help with artificial intelligence? So that one took a huge amount of. I remember one case I had to listen to a 3-hour video lecture to understand some of the details. And one of the nice things about the AI talk is that it has links at the bottom. So each slide almost has its own link. If you want more detail, you click on it and you can do it. So I've delivered that one. Also been very popular. I delivered that in China already and a couple other places. And that talk basically how artificial intelligence works, how machine learning works, how deep learning works, and how data intensive that is, and how Postgres as a database can effectively make artificial intelligence more useful. So again, really kind of an out there topic, but it's kind of like once you get to the end of the talk, you're like, oh, now I see why this is useful. There's a lot of artificial intelligence requires a lot of data. Postgres stores data in it. You can do, server-side languages that do AI and so forth. So PL Python, PL Perl. So it's kind of a nice kind of fit between sort of thinking of technology in a big way. Where is it going, whether it's the democratic part or artificial intelligence part, to kind of see where the industry is going and where Postgres will be going in the future.
Yeah. Like I've seen there's a lot of research about this. So people are so hyped up about artificial intelligence. They think it's the future. They tend to forget about databases sometimes.
Really true. Yeah. Really true. They think of it as this separate thing, right? And one thing I learned, and this is very similar. You think of how XML was done years ago. You're probably not old enough, but how XML was done years ago, how full text search was done years ago, how GIS was done years ago. Okay, how JSON was done years ago, where always that you thought, I'm going to have a main database for my transactions, and then I'm going to have a full text engine on the side, or I'm going to have a GIS engine on the side, or I'm going to have an XML database on the side, right? And what has happened over the years is as those technologies like GIS became standardized, they started to move into the database because everyone now understood there's a value to full text search, there's a value to GIS, there's a value to XML. Let's get that in where the data is. And I think where we
Mm-hmm.
are with artificial intelligence now is everyone thinks I want AI, but they're thinking of it just the same. It's something that's going to sit on the side of the database, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the way we have to do it. But over time, and I go into the talk, there's a huge number of reasons that doing AI in the database is much more beneficial than doing it outside the database. And I think that's where ultimately things are going to go. But we're not there yet. You're absolutely right. Most people think of AI and database as two separate topics, and I don't see why they're together. In fact, there's a lot of good reasons they should be together.
Yeah, totally. And do you think AI could be also applied in the database internals? Because I think so. It could be possible.
Yeah. So there's probably three. I should probably add a slide to this now that you mention it.
Oh,
There's probably three uses of AI in databases. One is the area I've talked about, using it effectively to manage your data. So AI to help predict things about your data, right? Whatever that is, whether it's predicting fraudulent transactions or recommendations for future videos or whatever. So that's the one area you can use it. The second area is using AI to make the database more functional, right? To make it more
yeah.
efficient. So that would be something in the optimizer, something in the executor feeding back to the optimizer to learn about how to get the data faster. And the third way is using AI for data management. So managing the database. So predicting when am I going to run out of disk space? Why this query doesn't look right? How can I use AI to make the management of my database more efficient and predict problems before they happen? Right. So that's the administration part. So there's like a performance part. There's an for AI, which would be probably in the optimizer. There's an administrative part, which would be predictive or issuing warnings based on AI, and then third would be really just using the customer data to predict business needs.
Yeah, totally. Does Postgres already implement anything of this, or is it totally new and something to do in the future?
No, I know there's some folks in China who have a fork of Postgres that I think has been doing some of this. I think Dave Page is trying to add some of this to the Postgres Enterprise Manager product that they have, that
Mm-hmm.
Enterprise DB has. Um, but I haven't, and I think there's some guys in Russia who did a little bit on this, but it's still experimental. It hasn't really kind of made it to the mainstream. But I think that definitely is going to increase going forward. But you're right, it's still in its infancy.
So, what do you expect then for people to learn from your talks?
Well, the democracy talk, I hope to show that this open source thing is really a long term trend. Um, Everyone has trouble getting their head around why open source is important. Why is it something that we've been working, like, for example, organization says we've been working with these billion-dollar companies for years. Why should I use open source, right? But they're probably already using open source with Linux. They're already using it with Apache and JBoss and Red Hat and all the other stuff. So why they think databases shouldn't be open source, I don't know. But what's interesting is that you look at open source adoption over the past 30 years that I've been involved in it, and it's really changed pretty dramatically. And I think the democracy talk shows to help you that just as democracy has expanded in the past 30 years globally, open source kind of expanding at that same rate, and the same trade-offs that happen with open source. Sometimes, you know, one of the bizarre parts of the talk is that there's a couple slides that say, autocracy actually sometimes is better than democracy for specific cases. Overall, it's worse, but there's some problems that democracy has trouble solving.
Mm-hmm.
And autocratic systems can kind of say we're going to do X, and that's going to happen. And with open source and proprietary, sometimes people like proprietary. It's predictable. There's one company that controls it. it's easy to understand. It's expensive and it's inefficient, but again, it has a couple advantages. Now, if you look at the overall product, lack of innovation and cost and inability to fix things quickly and a whole bunch of problems that proprietary has. But there are a couple advantages, right? And the same thing with open source. It does everything well. It does a lot of things well. There are a couple things it doesn't do very well. Some things can get stuck. Sometimes bugs aren't fixed properly or quickly enough. Although proprietary has a similar problem. So again, I think they to show them the trend and the AI talk. I think the value of that will be helping people understand that we're in the AI infancy. In fact, in that talk, I talk about the idea of AI has been around since the 1700s, I think. So you had like very early things, and you had this sort of automaton idea of artificial intelligence, and then in the 50s there was the Turing test and some other things, and then the 80s it was expert systems, and then the 90s was like AI winter, and now we've got this new machine learning thing. So it's really kind of an up and coming thing, but it's really has not played out. There's, as we talked about, there's so many other applications that we really haven't gotten to, and I think that one is just really to spark your interest to kind of see where the industry is going to be heading.
Aren't you afraid that your talk will become too political, especially because if you're from the USA and you are talking to people from Europe, there's already like such a big difference between political views. So aren't you like, isn't there this possibility
You
that
know,
it
I
backfires?
really thought that. Absolutely had that concern. Um, Particularly because sometimes I'm delivering this talk in other countries, like in Russia, right, which is sort of struggling right now, in a democracy front, in China, in Hong Kong, and some of the people I may be delivering a talk in Europe, but there might be people in Belarus, uh, other countries which are so I actually have gotten zero complaints, and I think it's because I've tried to be pretty down the road in the middle with it because um, when you're honest about the faults of your own system and your own government models, then it's kind of like, okay, it's not a dogmatic thing. You're really kind of painting the brush on everybody, right? Everyone's getting pluses and minuses. And yeah, it's interesting. I thought that some of these countries would never want me to give that talk. I honestly thought this. I thought I'm never going to be giving this talk in Russia. And I give the talk, and all of a sudden they want this talk. I'm like, really? Yes. I was like, okay. So again, it is really interesting what people will choose, and I don't know why they choose it. Maybe they have a political reason for choosing that talk. I have no idea. But I've tried to be down the middle of the road with it and not and to try and highlight the problems in my own country, so then somebody can look at it like, okay, he's not talking about problems in my country. He's explaining the problems in his country that are causing this, right? And that's a little easier to stomach, I think.
Now let's talk a bit about Postgres. So, do you remember your first contribution in Postgres?
Well, I was one of the people who sort of got Postgres out of the university and into the internet based development in 1996. So I do remember one of my first patches was, I think, the PSQL. There was something that wasn't working, and I found the bug pretty quickly. So I was a little unnerved because I downloaded it and I installed it, and within half an hour I found a bug, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, like, it's half an hour and I've already found a problem with this thing. How good can it be, right? Like, um, and then I remember submitting the patch and nothing happened because there was only one person at that time who was sort of packaging releases, and he already had a full-time job. So he could only package new releases like every certain number of months or whatever. Um, and then And then I remember reporting some other bugs, and they would point me to patches that were a couple months old. So I found these really obvious bugs, and they had already been fixed, but nobody had made a new release out of it. So I was like, well, that's kind of weird. You've got fixes that are pretty common, but nobody's kind of bundling them together and making a new release. And I thought, this software is really nice, but it needs some organization to get all these patches together. And that's how I got started, was kind of just going back through the old emails, getting all the patches that were going to fix things, and then talking to the current maintainer and saying, I'd like I'd like to continue with this project, and can we create a team to work on it? And they were very happy to do that. So that's how I actually got started, and just sort of collecting patches of other people and sometimes my own, and just putting out new releases so people felt there was momentum. There was, if you put out a patch and it gets released within a couple of weeks, you're like, oh great, that's good. Then I've done something productive, and I'll do it again. And that's the momentum we started, I guess, 24 years ago, and that's we're still looking at that process today.
So on the other side, like it's totally intimidating right now. So like I am 23 and I would like to be core developer one day, but if I look at the code base, I want to just like bang my head against the wall because it's too much. So if you have some, you know, tips for starters or something, that would be totally appreciated.
Sure. So when I started in '96, the code was still pretty big. I mean, it was probably a third the size it is now, but it was still overwhelming. I remember early on thinking, what if we have a bug in one of these directories and we can't find it? Like what? Because we didn't understand a lot of the code. We didn't understand a lot of the layers. And I'm thinking, what if we find a bug we just can't fix? And then we're stuck. Now, fortunately, I had a lot of people helping me. There's a guy, Vadim Mekev, out of Krasnoyarsk, Russia, who helped me a lot in the early years. And we never had a case where we found out a bug we couldn't fix. But what I'm trying to point out is that there's no question. Um, One of the things I realized as a developer is that when you create a single user application, okay, it has a certain level of complexity, right? As soon as you create a multi-user application, as a database is, the complexity becomes much higher, right? So, I had written database applications for years, but typically all of the concurrency was handled by the database. So I only had to worry about the application, and the database would handle the concurrency. Well, when you're writing the database, that concurrency is yours, right? You're the one who has to work on it. So I remember early on talking to my wife, and I'm like, this Postgres thing, it's really hard, but I'm learning a huge amount. And someday it might help me become a better developer uh, because I'm learning so much. At that point, I had been writing database applications for law firms for 7 years, so I was getting kind of bored, and this was really exciting. So I think the benefit is that when you get involved with the community, you're working with some of the best minds in the world. If you're doing open source database work, we're pretty much it, right, in terms of open source. So some of the people I worked with even early on, these people were just so smart that I couldn't even, they would ask a question. I couldn't even understand why they were asking the question. I didn't know the answer. Forget that. I didn't even know why the question was being asked. So I remember asking him, I said, why are you asking that question? And he would explain it to me. I'm like, okay, I don't know the answer still, but at least I know why you're asking the question, right? I was that far away from understanding. But what was really interesting was that people were willing to help. There was a community that everyone was new because the code came from the university. So nobody wrote it from scratch in our current team. So we all had to learn it, right? We all had to learn what was going on. And it's a lot of work. It is I will not admit it takes a couple months of study to really become competent in most of the structures. Now, we do have a developer's FAQ, which goes through how a developer would learn the code, some of the tools we use. There's a flow chart in there. There's some slides. There's a lot of slides on my website that talk about how to learn it. But it's a lot of roll up your sleeves and kind of just walk through what's going on. I mean, the good thing is the code is very clean. It's very easy to understand, very well organized, good comments, restructured. So that's a positive, and that's actually one of the most important things I did early on was to realize I'm not a great programmer, but if I can help other people be great programmers by making the code easy to understand, that's like much more useful, right? So instead of thinking about coding, I think about how can I make coding easier for other people, right? And I think that sort of mindset has sort of continued through the entire process. So people still think, is this going to be clear to people? Are they going to understand it? These type of qualities are not, you don't see it too much in proprietary software because you pay people to write that software. We don't pay people to write Postgres. So you have to make it as easy as possible. As hard as the code is, you've got to make it easy to understand for somebody who wants to take the time. And as you've seen, people who do take the time, they benefit in a number of ways. First, they become much better engineers because, as I said before, when you're dealing with a multi-user system, that kind of experience makes you a much better person at understanding how software is going to work. Right. Second, you're giving back to a much larger community. So you're whatever improvements you make are being used by thousands and thousands of people. Right. Third, you're working with a great group of people who are willing to help. So that part is you're getting not only are you helping, but people are helping you to succeed.
Yeah.
So fourth is that there's so much demand for Postgres people, right? That as you get good at this, people just show up and say, "Hey, we'd like you to work with us." So it's a great career move as well. So in terms of being a better engineer, contributing to a larger project, having other people help you, and then also improving your career prospects. These are all great reasons to get involved with the community, and I think it is worthwhile. Although I will say, it is probably the most complicated thing that I've been involved in, and almost everyone who works with Postgres will tell you that. So it is an incredibly complicated thing, and it does take a lot of time to get your head around how it solves a lot of these very difficult multi-user problems in a database. And I think it's fantastic. I learn a lot just by reading the code and looking at how people solve these problems.
Wow. So you would say the learning curve is like this, like super hard at first, but then it gets better. Oh,
It
okay.
does, yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's kind of encouraging to hear that even people like you struggle at first. So,
Everyone,
yeah.
even Tom Lane or Robert Haas, if you ask them, when I started with this thing, we had no. I remember Tom Lane and I had a call probably in 1997 or something about the optimizer, and we spent a couple hours on the phone trying to dig into exactly how it worked and why it wasn't working the way we wanted. And I remember like at the end of that call, we're like, wow, that was just crazy because we fixed the problem. We found out there
Oh.
was some bug in the way that the university had coded the optimizer, but it took both of us a couple hours on the phone to kind of bounce ideas off back and forth until we got to it. And he's gone on to become very good at it. I'm still probably in the infancy of understanding a lot of that stuff. So again, certain people get really good at certain aspects of the system, and I look at it. I'm like, okay, whatever you say. Yeah, there's definitely areas of the system that I understand really well, like PG upgrade, which I wrote it, right? But then a lot of people in the community are like, ugh, I don't want to get near that thing, right? It's just too complicated. It's the types of things it's doing are messy, and it has a lot of assumptions. Even there's a lot of comments in there. Um, People are like they'd rather me review it, or at least they want other people to review. So again, everyone has an expertise. You're not going to become an expert in the whole system because that would be just amazing to do.
Okay, let's wrap it up. So, last question. Let's talk about your favorite kind of movies. Apparently, are they your favorite kind of movies, or just nice kind of movies? How do you like Russian films?
Yeah, so I've watched a lot of Russian films, particularly because they have a tendency to address more difficult topics, I think,
Mm-hmm.
more um, more sophisticated topics maybe than a lot of Western films. So Tarkovsky, we've already talked about as being kind of one of my favorites because he does every it's the type of film where every scene has a meaning and everything in the scene kind of has a meaning. The pacing is very slow and deliberate, so you kind of the 3 hours of movie just kind of washes over you, which is the way I've usually heard it explained. Um, but I've also watched a number of Kurosawa movies from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Those are very good. Philip Glass has a good set of movies in the United States that he's produced. So there are some really interesting movies out there that help you look at the world differently. And those are the ones that always kind of get me when you see something in a movie and it helps you to understand your life better. That's usually, that's a great use of my time. And there are a number of out there. There's a lot of silly movies out there still, but there's still a lot of good ones out there. And usually the good ones are the ones who remain over a long period of time, and people talk about them and sort of analyze them and start to look at, well, why did that person do that, or why was that image in that scene? And it's usually a pretty good, interesting idea behind it, and you learn something by watching it. And those are always the ones I like.
I see, I see. So, what's your favorite Tarkovsky movie?
Probably Solaris would probably be. I'm a science fiction guy, big Star Trek guy, so probably that one. But we were talking earlier about catching up on movies. I had two Tarkovsky movies in my queue that I hadn't been able, probably had been there for 6 or 7 years.
Oh my god.
Andrei Lou Rublev and The Mirror, which I had not seen. I had been queued up for years, and because I'm in COVID, I'm like, all right, I have time to watch it now. So I was able to watch those. I felt I had a sense of accomplishment. I feel like understand Russia a little better for having watched
Mm-hmm.
it. So that was kind of cool.
I think we're done. I wouldn't keep you much longer because you're probably like in the middle of your afternoon and have work to do. It was really nice talking to you.
It worked out really well. Thank you. Glad we did this.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so talk to you soon. Thank you again for this chat. Have a good, what day is it? Tuesday? Good afternoon,
Yep.
evening.